In the summer of 2014, a family of 5, 2 parents and 3 young children, moved into a house in New Jersey. Moving into a new home can be an exciting time, meeting new people, starting new jobs and schools, maybe even being closer to extended family. For this family, however, things took a dark turn. This house had a watcher. Less than a week after moving in, the family began receiving letters. These letters described a desire for the young blood the family had brought to the house and asked if they had found out what was in the walls yet. The horror escalated once the writer claimed to know their names and to be trying to discover which bedrooms the children were using. While neighbors were skeptical, the family vacated the property and attempted to sell without success. Although this was a stalker and not a ghost, even in the 21st century, we still have bad places. Houses can have bad auras, reputations, or histories. Houses can terrify and victimize their inhabitants. You're listening to the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 3, and in this episode we're focusing on haunted houses. This is going to be the first of several episodes about this topic, so it might help to listen to them in order. So, I guess, starting off, what is it about this Watcher episode that's so unsettling?
What is not unsettling about that episode? I can imagine buying a house, and I looked this up online, and the house itself is a beautiful house. It's a gorgeous house in what looks like a nice neighborhood, and it just feels like a massive violation, especially when you have children and you have somebody who's saying that they want you to know what's in the walls, or they know which rooms your children are in.
I think that second part's the part that I find the most unsettling. But, I mean, obviously the what's in the walls is definitely creepy and unsettling, but the knowing which room your children sleep in has, for me at least, a more immediate threat or of danger.
Well, and referring to them as young blood, that in and of itself is terrifying.
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely the children are the ones being threatened, which is just the most terrifying thing because they're the most vulnerable.
Well, and especially as any parent will tell you, I mean, that to have that feeling of helplessness when your kids are in any kind of situation where they're sick or they're hurt or something like that that's terrifying in and of itself. But to have this level of helplessness where you're obviously being watched in some way and stalked and actually threatened, I mean, that's a whole other level of frightening.
And Mel, I'm wondering, because I didn't read this far into it, but do you know what happened with the family? How long did they stay in the house? I know you said they vacated, but how long did they stay there?
I don't think they stayed much past a couple months, because some of the letters actually implied that this person's father and grandfather had watched the place, and it continued to become more focused on the children. But I know in a couple of the articles I read, they were unable to sell the house. I mean, the house became stigmatized, and they felt like they had to disclose this anytime they would talk to someone they're going to sell the house to, which I found kind of interesting, that it can be a real estate problem, places where crimes have happened or things of this nature. Not only is an attack on the family, but it's also kind of an economic concern as well, because you just put all your money into buying a house and then you can't sell it or possibly move to a new one. In some ways you're kind of trapped. But yeah, some people say in the last article I read that this had not happened to previous families who lived in the house. So there's, that is a little bit scary as well, because then the family feels like they're the ones who are being singled out, or the center of this person's attention.
So I think the question that we really should also be addressing here is, this episode is supposed to be about haunted houses. So why are we opening up with this discussion of an obviously creepy and disturbing episode to talk about haunted houses.
Well, I think, and Lisa and I were talking about this earlier. I think this story, which is ostensibly, a true story, and was in the news, shares some characteristics of haunted house fiction. There's an implied connection to the past because the stalker is claiming that this is a long line. He's in a long line of observing and threatening families in the home, whether he was or he was not. And there's also kind of the ambiguity of it as well. I mean, if previous families didn't get letters, and if some of the neighbors don't really necessarily think that this is happening, you have that ambiguity that's often in haunted house books or films where people claim that something is haunted, but there's no, they can't get other people to believe them, or it's unclear as to what's going on. And you have that here as well, that yes, there are these letters, but still there's a lot of unanswered questions. The victimization of a family too, like we were talking earlier, that's the most vulnerable parts of the family are being threatened here, and lots of times in haunted house fiction, the family is the center of the attack, which makes it so terrifying. You should be safe with your family, or family should be safe, and there's some sort of threat, albeit this one is not supernatural, but there's still a threat from the outside, focusing on the home, which is supposed to be safe.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points there, Mel. For me, beyond just the desire to want to protect your children and to protect your family, and it's supposed to be a safe place, when one of the letters asked if they had found what was in the walls yet, that line in particular made me shudder. I honestly don't know if I were in that situation, would I immediately leave the house and not come back, or would I take an axe to the walls to find out what was inside? Because I think that plays up on several of our fears, that you may not be safe, but also that this house has some sort of very violent past. At least that's the way I read it. If he's asking what's in the walls, I'm assuming he doesn't just mean insulation. There's something in there, or at least so the watcher claims. And why does this house even have a watcher to begin with? That does imply a past, as you said. And I don't know what it is about that would scare us so much. It reminds me of every time I go to New Orleans and you're walking around the French Quarter and there are those signs selling the apartments, and they'll say not haunted right below the for sale sign. I don't know if in New Orleans if that's something that's desirable or not, but we are kind of afraid of a house that has a past. There are websites that you can go to and type in your address to see if anyone had died in your house, and I don't know why that would terrify us so much.
It's also a kind of secret, too. Like, it's something about your home that you don't know about. So it's not just the threat of it or what happened in the past, but it's also that it's hidden from you. Like, you have to dig something up, or you have to cut the walls open to find out. And your house, you like to think, is this place where you have intimate connections and you feel, quote unquote, at home there. And if there's something there that you don't know about, there's like an extra room that you didn't know was there, or there's something hidden in your walls. I think in some ways it's kind of like the outside threat. Again, it's like something you didn't know about happening in this space that's so personal.
Yeah, Matt, you make the joke that you're glad you live in new construction, but read Anne River Sidens or Daniel Lusky, and you'll know that just because something is a new construction or it's not some sort of old Gothic home doesn't mean you're going to get a free pass from the haunted aspect. And I think that's, Mel, what you just said really hits on it, is that it's something that's hidden away from us, because when we are in our home, we think we know everything about the space. Most of us, when we move into a place, will do everything we can to make it our own. We put our favorite colors in the paint up on the wall. We hang curtains. We surround ourselves with the things that we love, whether it's artwork on the walls or, in my case, stacks and stacks of books all over the place. And we make it our own. And to have something that doesn't belong to us and that is hidden away from us is terrifying, because this is supposed to be a space that is solely ours. Everything else out in the world, that doesn't belong to us. Our home, where we sleep, where we eat, where we spend time with our family, where we sit and watch TV, that is supposed to be the safe place. That is supposed to belong to us. I think these haunted houses scare us so much because it reminds us that they don't belong to us.
Well, I'm pretty sure, actually, just touching on that new construction thing, too, if you remember the movie Poltergeist, I'm almost certain that was a new construction house, too. It just happened to have just been built on a Indian burial ground. But no, I agree with with both of what you're saying about that idea of that safe space, that invasion almost of your personal castle, as some people refer to their houses. I mean, this is, well, not to repeat what everyone said too much, but I mean, it's your home, it's your place. And I remember one time years ago, I was in my little study area room, and I had a friend who was coming by, and they just walked right on in without knocking or anything. And at the time, my door wasn't locked, and it really bothered me. And this was someone who I was even expecting to come. They weren't just dropping by unannounced. I was expecting them to come by, but they just walked in and like it was nothing. And, you know, it's just one of those little things that's just like really got on my nerves and really bothered me. And I mean, I think if that had been a ghost, you know, or something that was unexplainable or you know, something like that, that would have been even worse in the sense of violating that sense of safety and whatnot.
So if we're talking about haunted houses, does it make it worse if it's a ghost or something supernatural versus if you're talking about an invasion story or in something like the Watcher story where you just have some sort of stalker? Is it made worse just by the very fact that it is supernatural?
I think for me it is, partly because if someone breaks into your house and holds you hostage, if you call the police or your family or anyone else, they will absolutely believe that this happened. But if you feel like you're being haunted, there is that doubting your own sanity. Am I crazy, or is this happening? And, you know, I mean, I like to think that I'm a fairly rational person, but if really weird stuff was happening and I told my friends or family, hey, I'm going to call the ghost hunters because I think my house is haunted, I'd probably get some raised eyebrows and odd looks, you know, even from the people that are less or more likely to believe in those sorts of things than I am.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It seems like the supernatural and the home invasion or this kind of stalker scenario both scare us because it's lack of control. Like, we like to think that we're active and in control of our lives, and then all of a sudden we get sucked into someone else's narrative that they're writing for us, and we end up reacting to things rather than being active. But I think you're right, Matt, that, you know, if somebody is following you or watching you, or somebody commits a crime against you, you do have recourse to the justice system, we hope. Whereas if it's a ghost, you know, there's the lack of control goes beyond that, because you may not even believe yourself if you're very skeptical, or other people may not believe you. So what are you going to do? I mean, you can't necessarily call Ghostbusters. And so you end up in this place where the psychological effect possibly of not knowing what to believe and not having people believe you is just as damaging.
Well, and you even hear stories of people who are being stalked, and, you know, other people think that they're blowing things out of proportion, or that maybe they're exaggerating. I mean, imagine amplifying that with the idea of talking about a paranormal event. I think my house is haunted. I think, you know, there's a ghost throwing dishes out of my cupboards every day. That level of disbelief from people is just going to skyrocket, even from people who aren't skeptical. I mean, are you sure that it's a ghost? That's not a fault line, it's not, you know, magnetic waves, I don't know, whatever explanations are, but
underground tunnels.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. When you talk about haunted houses and you talk about some of the more infamous ones like Amityville Horror, you know, that's a classic case of here you have a family who moved into a house that did have a violent past. They say they experienced something very supernatural. They wrote a book about it. Movies have been made about it. And yet to this day, people still dispute whether or not it actually occurred, or were they just doing it all so that they could write a book and make money?
I was just thinking while you were talking, Lisa, that it seems like maybe that's why everybody is so obsessed with shows like Ghost Hunters and why we have multiple seasons of it, because people want to know. They want to have some sort of audio or video proof of things that we can't explain.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? The funny thing about those shows is, I've watched some of them, and some of the video that they show is absolutely terrifying when you're watching it. But then almost immediately somebody somewhere on the internet can come up with how that was faked. It's like there will never truly be evidence that everyone will accept as, yes, that was a haunting. Yes, somebody did invade that space. Yes, that's a voice from the past. So it does constantly become something that you either have to question your own sanity, or you have to question the sanity of others, or you have to question the honesty of others.
But that's the supernatural, right? I mean, if we had an answer for it, it wouldn't be supernatural anymore. I mean, I think that's why the supernatural is still scary, even in the 21st century. I think it was Edith Wharton said that with electricity and various other technologies, ghost stories wouldn't be very scary anymore. But the things that we can't explain, like the ineffable, the thing that you can't name, we're always going to be searching for explanations, and people are always going to be debunking it. It's like, if you could explain it, it wouldn't be scary anymore.
The very nature of the uncanny.
Right. In fact, maybe that could be our segue. We've been talking around the uncanny. Okay, so I think we should probably pause here for a definition of the uncanny. And as a term, the uncanny actually comes from Sigmund Freud. He, if I remember correctly, was writing about this kind of feeling that people have when something familiar to us becomes strange in some way, or something that he used the term unheimlich, which, Lisa, you can correct my German, or unhomely, where something that was familiar to us or homely, particularly the house where we're supposed to feel comfortable and safe, becomes terrifying or disturbing in some fashion. So mirrors, when you look in a mirror at your reflection, it's not supposed to move separately from you or wink at you or something like that. Children are supposed to be lovable, and yet they end up being creepy murderers sometimes. And puppets or androids also work in this as well. Things that are, the uncanny valley. The closer something gets to us, but is still different from us as human beings, the more terrifying it is. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far really plays into that. This idea of a secret that we don't quite understand in our house. That's really creepy and uncanny and unfamiliar. And families feeling unsafe in homes. Children being the victims, these sorts of things all feed into that uncanny idea that the house in particular exploits so well.
Well, that's just uncanny.
Oh.
But in all seriousness, with the uncanny, so that means sort of like, and I know we've referenced this in a previous episode, just sort of, tangentially, but that book, House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, the whole central thing about this book is that it's a haunted house in the sense that the house has a door that should lead outside, but when you open it up, there's a hallway that shouldn't be there. Mel, would that fit in with your uncanny aspect right there?
I think so, because again, it's like your senses or your way of thinking of quote unquote normalcy is thrown off. Like, you think your house should stay in one shape, but you open a door and it's actually growing, which is another form of unveiling of a secret in a way too. Only the house itself is keeping that secret from you. I don't know, Lisa, can you come up with an example of the uncanny?
Well, I'm just wondering if something like The House Next Door by Anne River Sidons would kind of fit into that. Although in that case, the house itself is more of a mirror, kind of holding up your own fears back to you, I guess. I don't know if that would be considered uncanny.
I'm not really sure. When I think of that book, I usually think of it as more of either a bad place, like it's manipulating people, like it's just evil, Or I think of it, which I guess can be uncanny because your house shouldn't be evil, but or psychological, that we don't quite know if it's the people or the house. You see what I mean?
No, I see what you mean there. I see what you mean there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could still make the argument it's uncanny. The thing about the uncanny to me is that it seems to underlie almost all of horror, because almost the definition of horror is making something familiar unfamiliar. It's when you think you're safe and all of a sudden you realize you're in the wrong place at the wrong time that kind of trips you up and frightens you.
Wasn't that part of the horror aspect in Frankenstein, where, I mean, Frankenstein, the scientist, is so dedicated to building life from stitching together these corpses, but when he actually brings it to life and actually sees it alive, that's when he freaks out and runs away in terror, probably, I mean, I would argue because of the monster is in that uncanny valley. It's a thing that's alive that shouldn't be alive, and it's not quite human, and that's where that terror lies. I mean, that's sort of, I think that really does underlie a lot of different horror.
Is that why so many dolls are possessed?
Yeah. Or even vampires and zombies, because they're moving around as if they're alive, but they're really not, and they kind of seem human, but they're really not. You have that kind of fuzzy border.
Well, think even of that. I mean, let's leave the sheer abundance of sequels out, but the first one, Child's Play. I mean, it's not it is a goofy horror movie from the 80s, but that idea of this toy doll coming to life and trying to kill you, in this case because it's possessed with the soul of a murderer, whatever, possessed doll trying to kill you is I mean, I think that idea of, are my toys still alive and moving around when I'm not playing with them, is something every kid kind of wonders at some point. And maybe they're not all like Toy Story. Maybe some of them are like Child's Play, and that's where things get really creepy if you let yourself dwell on that for too long.
Oh, I mean, talking dolls are creepy. Even baby dolls that don't talk are creepy. They're creepy. This is a fear of mine as a child. So.
Look, me too. But that does bring up an interesting point when you're talking about haunted houses, and you start to think about what are the tropes that go along. If you're reading or watching something in the haunted house genre, one of those is taking those spaces and turning them into something that we would fear. And we're talking about baby dolls, but so often you have the space of the baby's room or the nursery that become the space of the haunting. Immediately I think of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and how there's the space of the nursery there, but then you also have, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but the gothic horror movie. It was the first release of Hammer Films in a while, and had, I believe, Harry Potter in it. The Woman in Black?
Oh, yeah. I was actually right? Susan Hill's The Woman in Black, the book, but yeah, Daniel Radcliffe was in the movie. Yeah, the nursery is also haunted in the book and the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those tend to, you very rarely see, for instance, oh, my kitchen is haunted. It always does tend to be like, it's the baby's room, or it's my little girl's room in Poltergeist, or it's, I guess because those spaces are supposed to be extra innocent, maybe.
I think that also brings up that idea of that domestic horror of the family being in jeopardy, and especially if you're talking about like an infant or a toddler. I mean, we always think of them as being, these innocent creatures that are completely indefensible, because they are, they can't talk yet. They, maybe if you're talking a toddler, they can walk, but they can't, communicate for help very well, and yet here's something that's threatening them in some way in their space, in their room. Just thinking about that's making me a little upset, because I just don't even like that idea.
Yeah, that circles back to that idea of an invasion of the safe space, definitely.
Right. I was just thinking how many possessions happen to younger girls or women. Not always, but usually when you have possession, what's the scariest thing? A child, being possessed or forced to do things that are not childlike. Loss of control and preying on the vulnerable.
I hadn't even thought of possessions, but I think you're absolutely right there.
Isn't possessions just another form of haunted house, though, when you really get down to it?
Ooh, the house's mind?
Yeah.
If you think about that movie Paranormal Activity, I mean, they sort of end up with both. And again, let's not talk about the infinite sequels. The first one is not the greatest movie, but it's got some good jump scares and whatnot. But I mean, they kind of played with that idea of not just, I mean, it starts out as what you think's a haunted house, but it turns out to be this demonic presence that's been following the character since childhood. And I think there is a huge overlap between possession and haunted house in a sense.
Which, if you're looking at the haunted house as kind of a metaphor for the mind, in that case, in that particular movie, and in I think a lot of cases, the attic was a place where the demon was located during most of the movie. That's where they found, it's been so long since I've seen the movie.
The marked picture.
Right, the marked picture. And they kind of got the idea that that's where it was residing when it wasn't terrorizing them. And if you think about the house as a metaphor for the human, I guess, face or body, that the attic would be the mind.
Or the basement is your subconscious. Yeah, like the basement or the dungeon where you hide things.
Yeah, two prime places. If you have those in your house, they're probably haunted.
So many horror movies use that trope, too. I mean, you've got the skeleton key where the ritual is performed in the attic of the house. You've got the Amityville Horror, which we've talked about, where it's in the basement, where the climax of the movie happens before the family gets out. I mean, you've got your mind being invaded or perhaps your subconscious leaking out in really terrifying ways. That's really interesting reading there.
Yeah, Ty West's House of the Devil. That's in the attic as well, I believe.
Well, and if you think about it, too, the attic or the basement, well, like Mel said, is a place where you store all the stuff that you don't have room for or that you don't want out in the house itself. But it's also just where it's a closed-off space. It's not usually, immediately at least, accessible to any of us. I mean, I'm not going up into my attic every day. I don't have a cellar, but if I did, well, I'd probably go into it all the time because I've turned it into a game room or something. In most of those sorts of houses, though, that's, the sort of place where it's your overflow. It's where you're keeping the stuff that you don't bring out into the daylight, so to speak. So. Well,
and that also kind of links to the idea of the house's personality, the house's mind, but the house's face, like linking the people who live in the house and their psychological state to the building. So I guess like the House of Usher, right? Poe's story where the family is the house and the house is the family to the point where the house actually looks like a face, the way the windows and the door are set up. Or The Haunting of Hill House, as Lisa mentioned earlier, when you look at the house, she says something about how a cornice on a window is like an eyebrow, that you don't have to move into a house that's already haunted. You can take the haunt with you because it's your own personal issue that you're trying to work through that attacks you in the house. It kind of like Paranormal Activity where she brings the demon into the home. The home is fine until she comes into it. Or Chris Bajalian's book, I think it was The Night Strangers was the title, where the man and his family move into a home and all the weird things about the house correspond to this traumatic plane crash that he was in. And he starts to be haunted by the people who he couldn't save. So the houses themselves are fine until haunted people walk into them.
Well, along with that personality issue, I think one of the things about haunted houses that we've kind of touched on and kind of hinted around at is this idea of this history of like previous inhabitants or just history in general of the space that it was built on. We've mentioned Poltergeist with this Indian burial ground or murders in previous places. I mean, I think of that movie Stir of Echoes, if either one of you have seen that one, where Kevin Bacon is haunted by the ghost of a girl who was murdered and buried in the house that he and his family have moved into.
I honestly don't remember that movie. I know I saw it. I don't remember much of it, but what you said, you can have a haunting that is personally driven, whether it was somebody in the house maybe who was murdered and wants vengeance, or maybe you bring the haunting into the house yourself because of some past you're trying to escape, but the past won't let you escape it. But then, there's a reason that so many horror movies, especially in the 1980s, revolved around, it was that your house was built over an Indian burial ground, as you said, because there is a kind of collective past that, at least here in the United States, we all share, and we all share our own guilt, whether it's the genocide of the Native Americans, whether it's slavery, and that bubbles up and forms the haunting.
Yeah, I mean, we like to think, different scholars of American Gothic talk about how we like to think that our history is always moving forward and always progressing. But then we have these moments in our past that we don't necessarily want to deal with or memorialize, whether it be, Hawthorne talking about how no one is paying, no one talks about the Salem witch trial hysteria, or Toni Morrison writing Beloved in order to bring up the country's past with slavery. Or the Indian burial ground idea dealing with our past with Native American removal. But there's also a flip side to that, too. I think sometimes horror and the supernatural can be problematic when it deals with those things, because at the same time, I'm specifically thinking of the Native American burial ground. Yes, it's that history haunting us, but usually those Native American people are not characters in the book. Like they're I think I mentioned this in the last episode, there's kind of an erasure. So the past is there, but it's buried. It's in the graveyard, and the characters just deal with these demons. They don't ever deal with the specifics of why those people live there, or what even is the group of people who live there. You see what I mean? They leave that blank in a way. So it's haunting, but there's not a real explanation of the detail.
I think Alfred Hitchcock used the word MacGuffin to describe that, where it's the thing that you never quite see on screen, but is there to move the plot forward and advance the plot. The money that's stolen at the very beginning of Psycho is sort of the MacGuffin that causes the whole, action to happen in that movie. In this case, the Native Americans are often, they never appear, or they rarely appear, at least on screen, as actual ghosts that you see. They're just there serving as this MacGuffin. So is that kind of what you mean by erasure?
Yeah, I think so. Because the past is there because there's the burial ground that's there, but we're never told who the native peoples were who were there. We're never told what happened that caused this. So it's an easy way to say your house is haunted because it's on a graveyard, but we don't get the detail of how that happened. We don't get the specifics of the past. It's just kind of used to move the plot along.
So it's like a double erasure in that case.
How do you mean?
I say we as, maybe writers who would use that as a trope or as a MacGuffin, Matt, as you said. They recognize that there is something unsavory in our past that we all are aware of. They recognize it enough to use it as an element in their story, but they don't want to give it enough attention or enough detail or enough research, whatever, to actually make it to become part of the story.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. Instead of researching what actual groups or populations may have lived in your region, you just take whatever comes to hand for that particular plot stroke.
Right. It just becomes kind of a convenient tool in the writer's toolbox without actually giving it any real consideration.
Well, and this goes to the different ways of looking at the ghost, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But there are like actual supernatural ghosts, which could be a dead person coming back because they're trying to point out, I don't know, like who killed them or where the will is or get vengeance or something. But then you also have people in books who are alive, but they seem like they're haunting the story that they're in, that they're not fully fleshed out or they're marginalized and not part of any community. And often in in like the history of American literature, at least, there are moments when these characters are, Native American or women or African American or different minority groups that kind of are spectral in the literature rather than taking actual bodily form as characters. Sometimes they do by the end of the book once the haunting is resolved, and sometimes they never do.
So Mel, do you see that kind of ghosting at work in something like Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables?
Yeah. I mean, I think Hawthorne in particular is somewhat interesting to talk about with that, but particularly House of Seven Gables in a couple ways. In one, I talk about when I'm teaching it with my students, how we get so into the fact of I think it was the Malls and the Pynchons disputing over the land and the house, but Hawthorne glosses over so quickly and vaguely the fact that there were indigenous people there before the Malls took the land, and then the Pynchons took the land from them. And so you have that layer that we see or we think of as readers, but Hawthorne doesn't necessarily give us, because he goes right into the witch aspects of it, the witch paranoia. And then the other aspect, I think, is in the map that the Pynchons have and like to show everybody of their land. I think it's in Maine. And there are pictures of animals that aren't actually there. And there are pictures of Native Americans on the deed, but there's no explanation of who they are or, what it means that these people own this house, own this land. And the Pynchons just happen to have this deed to it. And so those characters end up kind of in the ghostly background, even though as readers now we're curious as to who these people are and how their ownership of this property in both places isn't being respected and what that means, but Hawthorne glosses over it.
Well, I know we've talked about all of these tropes, and we're definitely going to get a bit more in depth with them and how they work specifically in our upcoming episodes. Maybe before we end, we should just talk about some of our favorite of these. I mean, we've talked about a lot of things, and I mean, Mel, what is your favorite haunted house, book or movie?
Oh, wow. I think my favorite haunted house book is The Haunting of Hill House. I can remember when I got it when I was in high school just to read for fun, and I loved it so much that now I've published articles on it and taught it in several classes. I just keep coming back to that book. It's such a great haunted house narrative. Matt, what are your favorite haunted houses in books and movies?
Oh, I think for me it's kind of a toss-up. There's not a lot of consensus on The Shining as far as film adaptations, but I was rather young when I watched The Shining, the Kubrick version, and that one stayed with me to the point where there have been several times where I've been in hotels and noticed that the carpet looked vaguely like the overlook in the movie, and it's made me very uncomfortable. I know it's a haunted hotel and not a house, but I think it fits in with the theme. But it's kind of a toss-up between The Shining and the other one would be the one I mentioned earlier, House of Leaves. That book, I've said before, my threshold for horror is pretty high, and I remember I read that book in about 5 days while I was in college. In the middle of taking 4 classes, I pretty much put all of my work aside to read the book because I was so engrossed, and I finished it about 2 a.m. as a thunderstorm rolled in, and the small little house I lived in had a tree right above the roof that was scraping, the branch was scraping across the roof in the wind, and I guess that ambiance sort of helped freak me out. But that book freaked me out in a way that most books don't, and I honestly cannot put my finger on exactly why. And that's what kind of unnerved me, was I didn't know why it scared me. But it's so good. It's so well written and just a postmodern craziness. I love it. What about you, Lisa?
I feel like I should have gone first after those two, because honestly, the first 2 things that came to my mind were Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which will forever be one of my favorite novels, if not my favorite novel. You cannot read a contemporary haunted house narrative without comparing it, I think, to Shirley Jackson's version of Hill House. That being said, I really enjoy, this is just for something different, I really enjoy Richard Matheson's Hell House. I think I enjoy it in part because it's such a great companion piece to The Haunting of Hill House. There are so many things that are similar as far as you have a group of psychic investigators or psychic detectives, supernatural detectives, however you want to describe them, that go into a house that has a history of haunting. But Hell House, especially when it's read after you read The Haunting of Hill House, it's just fun. Matheson really doesn't hold anything back. And to me, that's fun. It's just the abandon at which he writes some of the ghosts and the haunting. He makes it very visceral, I guess. And for me, if I'm looking at one that was published more recently, it is, Matt, I agree with you, it's House of Leaves, for sure. That book, and I think part of it is the fact that even though I've read it many, many times, I still can't put my finger on why it did scare me. I think part of it is that just the very idea, maybe it's that it doesn't have, not even a past. There isn't a reason for what is going on with the house. There isn't, there's not a ghost story that goes along with House of Leaves. In Hell House, you get a reason for why there's the haunting. In The Haunting of Hill House, you get a reason for why Hill House is such an evil and dark place. But with something like House of Leaves, you don't really get an explanation. There's no story that goes along with it. It just happened. And I think Daniel Lewski strips away a lot of what I guess contemporary audiences might consider trite. Things that do happen in older haunted house stories. The spooky noises, the blood on the walls, the seeing something in a mirror. There's really not a whole lot of that in House of Leaves. And when you try to explain it to somebody and say, well, it's about a house that starts out, it's an inch bigger on the inside than on the outside. That sounds ridiculous. But I cannot express to you the terror that comes when you're reading the book and you realize that the house is an inch bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that it keeps going. But there's no reason behind it. I mean, there's no story. There's nothing. And I think that for me is what is so terrifying in that book.
We'll continue discussing haunted houses over the next several episodes. Next time, we'll be looking at if a haunted house represents the psychology of the people inside of it, or if it's just an evil place. Join us in 2 weeks.
This is the No Fear podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.